The story of Ernesto Guevara does not begin in the smoke of guerrilla camps or the halls of government power. It begins far away from the front lines, in the bustling, industrial city of Rosario, Argentina. Born on June 14, 1928, into an upper-middle-class family of diverse European descent, Ernesto was the eldest of 5 children. His parents, Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna y Losa, were free-thinking, politically engaged, and unconventional for their social class. They raised their children in an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity, reading widely, debating philosophy and politics openly, and rejecting many of the rigid bourgeois social norms of traditional Argentine society. From his earliest days, Ernesto's life was shaped by an invisible, relentless companion: severe asthma. When he was just 2 years old, he suffered a particularly violent attack of bronchial asthma that nearly took his life. This medical crisis permanently altered the course of the family's life. Seeking a healthier climate for their ailing son, his parents packed up and moved the household to Altagracia, a picturesque town nestled in the dry, mountainous hills of the Córdoba province. It was here, amidst the sweeping landscapes and clean air of the hills, that Ernesto spent the formative years of his childhood and youth. Despite the physical limitations imposed by his chronic illness, Ernesto refused to live a sheltered life. His parents, particularly his mother Celia, encouraged him to be resilient, active, and independent. Rather than keeping him isolated indoors, they allowed him to play sports, run through the fields, and climb trees, accepting the risk of his asthma attacks as the price of a normal, vibrant childhood. Ernesto developed a fierce, stubborn determination. When an asthma attack struck, leaving him gasping for breath, he learned to endure it with a quiet, steely resolve that astonished those around him. This early struggle forged a stubborn resilience, a psychological toughness that would define his entire character. Because of his frequent bouts of illness, Ernesto missed months of traditional schooling at a time. To compensate, his mother, a well-read and fiercely independent woman who defied the traditional domestic roles expected of women of her social standing, took on the task of homeschooling him. She instilled in him a deep, lifelong love for literature, poetry, and philosophy. Ernesto became an avid and voracious reader from a remarkably early age. While other children were playing outdoors, young Ernesto could often be found curled up in a corner, devouring everything from adventure novels by Jules Verne and Emilio Salgari to complex works of philosophy, history, and political economy. He possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world far beyond the borders of Altagracia and Argentina. As he grew into a teenager, Ernesto returned to Córdoba for his secondary education at the Colegio Nacional de Funes. Despite his ongoing health struggles and interrupted formal education, he proved to be an intelligent and fiercely independent student. He was not a traditional, obedient scholar who simply memorized textbooks. Instead, he questioned assumptions, engaged in heated debates with his teachers and peers, and displayed an early penchant for nonconformity. He dressed casually, often wearing rumpled clothes, and cared very little for the social status, wealth, and polite hypocrisy of the upper-class society into which he was born. He preferred the company of ordinary working people, local artisans, and intellectual peers who shared his growing passion for ideas and debate. Sport played a massive role in shaping Ernesto's personality during his youth. Despite his asthma, which meant he would often have to stop a rugby match to use an inhaler or catch his breath, he became a fearless, passionate rugby player. He played for the local team in Córdoba, earning the nickname Fuser, a combination of his mother's surname, de la Serna, and his own surname, Guevara, combined with the word furioso for his fierce playing style on the pitch. On the rugby field, he was known for his relentless tackling, total disregard for his own physical safety, and fierce competitive spirit. Sport taught him teamwork, discipline, and the value of physical endurance under pressure. By the time he finished secondary school, the Guevara family moved to Buenos Aires, the sprawling, cosmopolitan capital of Argentina. For a young man from the provinces, Buenos Aires was an overwhelming center of culture, politics, and social contradictions. In 1947, following in the footsteps of many young men of his background, Ernesto enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. Medicine seemed a natural calling for someone who had spent his entire life intimately acquainted with illness, suffering, and the healing arts. Yet, even as a medical student, Ernesto's interests extended far beyond anatomy and pharmacology. He spent long hours reading poetry, studying history, and discussing the turbulent political climate of post-war Argentina under the populist regime of Juan Domingo Perón. During his university years, Ernesto's independent spirit began to manifest in a deep desire to see the wider world. Confined for so long to the hills of Cordoba and the streets of Buenos Aires, he yearned to experience the reality of Latin America firsthand. He began undertaking long, solitary journeys across Argentina, sometimes strapping a small motor to a bicycle to travel thousands of miles through remote rural provinces. These journeys were not vacations of leisure. They were tests of endurance and early explorations of the vast socio-economic divides that scarred his homeland and the wider continent. In these early years, Ernesto was not yet a committed Marxist revolutionary. He was an adventurous, restless young intellectual with a romantic soul, a sharp analytical mind, and a deep sense of empathy for the underdog. He chafed against the comfortable, predictable destiny laid out for him by his affluent background, the books he read, the physical pain he conquered, the diverse people he met along the roads of Argentina, and the intellectual debates around his family's dinner table all laid the psychological and emotional groundwork for the radical transformation that was to come. The boy from Rosario, shaped by asthma, books, rugby, and a restless wanderlust, was quietly preparing to step out onto a much larger stage, ready to confront the injustices of a continent. The transition from the academic halls of Buenos Aires and the familiar roads of Argentina to the vast, untamed expanses of South America began not as a grand political crusade, but as an audacious adventure between two young friends. Ernesto Guevara, now a 23-year-old medical student with a restless soul and a growing curiosity about the world beyond his textbooks, found himself increasingly suffocated by the predictable trajectory of middle-class Argentine life. Alongside his older friend Alberto Granado, a biochemist with an equally adventurous spirit and a warm, infectious laugh, Ernesto conceived a plan that would change the course of his life forever. A motorcycle journey across the length and breadth of South America. Their vehicle of choice was a rickety, heavily used 1939 Norton 500cc motorcycle, affectionately and somewhat optimistically nicknamed La Poderosa, meaning the mighty one. To two young men accustomed to books and urban comforts, the machine represented freedom, mobility, and the key to unlocking the mysteries of a continent they had only ever read about in poetry and geography tracts. In late December 1951, amidst the tearful goodbyes of family and friends who viewed their undertaking as little more than reckless folly, Ernesto and Alberto roared out of Buenos Aires. The early weeks of the journey tested their patience and mechanical ingenuity almost immediately. La Poderosa was far from mighty. She sputtered, leaked oil, shed parts, and broke down with reliable monotony on the dusty, unpaved roads of rural Argentina. The two travelers spent as much time repairing the engine with grease-stained hands as they did riding it. Yet these mechanical failures, rather than dampening their spirits, forced them to slow down and interact intimately with the local people. They relied on the kindness of strangers, sleeping in mechanic shops, police stations, fields, and roadside ditches. Ernesto, despite his chronic asthma, which required him to carry his inhaler and occasionally pause to catch his breath during strenuous physical exertion, threw himself into the hardship with stubborn enthusiasm. He refused to let his physical frailty diminish his role in the great enterprise. As they pushed further north, leaving the familiarity of the Argentine pampas behind, the landscape transformed dramatically, opening up into the towering, majestic, and unforgiving peaks of the Andes. The cold mountain air posed a constant threat to Ernesto's compromised lungs, but the sheer grandeur of the geography fueled his romantic imagination. They crossed the border into Chile, riding through sweeping valleys and windswept deserts where the climate grew increasingly harsh. By this point, La Poderosa had suffered terminal mechanical failure, forcing the two friends to abandon their beloved motorcycle in a small Chilean town and continue their journey on foot, by hitchhiking on trucks and boarding cargo ships. Though the loss of the motorcycle was a blow to their pride, it paradoxically liberated them. Unencumbered by a heavy machine, they were forced to merge more deeply with the daily lives of the working class, peasants, and marginalized populations who populated the margins of society. It was during these grueling weeks in Chile that the journey began its profound psychological and emotional evolution. Ernesto and Alberto found themselves passing through the vast mining regions of northern Chile, where they encountered workers who toiled in brutal conditions under the hot sun for the enrichment of foreign corporate interests. They visited the massive copper mines of Chuquicamata, where Ernesto observed firsthand the staggering human cost of industrial exploitation. The miners he met were gaunt, exhausted, and impoverished, their lungs ruined by mineral dust, living in miserable shacks far removed from the wealth they extracted from the earth. Ernesto spent hours talking with them, listening to their bitter complaints about exploitation, low wages, and political neglect. For the first time, poverty ceased to be an abstract concept studied in medical books or debated in university coffee shops. It had a human face, a tired voice, and a calloused hand. Continuing their northward trek, the travelers crossed into Peru, entering a land steeped in ancient history, yet profoundly scarred by modern inequality. In Peru, the deep historical wounds of indigenous communities came sharply into focus. Ernesto, whose reading had already given him an appreciation for pre-Columbian cultures, was deeply moved and disturbed by the stark division between the wealthy urban elites and the impoverished, disenfranchised indigenous populations who lived in the shadow of the Andes. In Cusco, the ancient capital of the Inca Empire, he observed magnificent stone architecture standing in silent, poignant contrast to the squalor and neglect in which modern indigenous descendants lived. He visited hospitals and clinics, where he witnessed the horrifying toll of tuberculosis, malnutrition, and a complete lack of medical care for the rural poor. The medical student who had set out to cure individual bodies began to realize that the diseases he was treating were merely symptoms of a deeper, systemic social sickness. One of the most transformative stops on their itinerary was the isolated leper colony of San Pablo, situated deep in the Amazon basin of Peru. Volunteering their services as medical students, Ernesto and Alberto spent several weeks living and working among patients afflicted with leprosy. In an era when leprosy patients were universally shunned, feared, and cast out to the fringes of humanity. Ernesto broke social taboos by refusing to wear gloves when examining patients, shaking their hands, playing soccer with them, and sitting closely by their bedsides to listen to their life stories. This period profoundly challenged his notions of human dignity and solidarity. He saw that physical isolation was often compounded by social abandonment, and his empathy expanded into a fierce, protective compassion for the outcasts of society. As they traveled onward through Colombia, a country itself torn apart by a brutal civil conflict known as La Violencia, the dangers of the continent's political instability became terrifyingly real. They were briefly arrested on suspicion of being agitators, witnessed the tense atmosphere of military patrols, and saw the silent terror etched into the faces of ordinary villagers caught in the crossfire of political factionalism. Yet through all the uncertainty, the exhaustion, and the illness, Ernesto's worldview was steadily hardening. The romantic wanderer who had left Buenos Aires out of a desire for adventure was slowly dissolving, replaced by an acute observer of social injustice who felt an unbearable weight of responsibility for the suffering he witnessed. By the time the journey concluded in Venezuela, where Alberto chose to remain to work at the leper colony, while Ernesto took a brief detour to the United States before returning to Argentina, the young medical student was fundamentally transformed. The geographical map of South America had become a personal map of human pain, resilience, and revolutionary potential. The motorcycle journey did not make Ernesto an overnight Marxist, but it shattered his provincial innocence. He had touched the raw nerve of the continent's social reality, walking its roads, breathing its dust, and sharing the meager meals of its poorest citizens. The carefree boy from Rosario had looked into the mirror of Latin America's collective suffering and recognized that the world as it was structured was utterly intolerable, setting the stage for his fateful drift toward radical political action. The return to Argentina in the late summer of 1952 brought a strange, disorienting quiet after the thunderous roar of the Andean roads and the overwhelming human currents of the northern countries. Ernesto Guevara found himself back within the familiar walls of his family home in Buenos Aires, surrounded by the comforts of middle-class life that had once felt so suffocating. Yet the young man who unpacked his worn leather rucksack was entirely different from the medical student who had ridden out of the city atop La Poderosa less than a year earlier. His notebooks were filled with dense observations, sketches, and reflections on the misery he had witnessed from the salt flats of Chile to the Amazonian banks of Peru. Friends and family members noticed a new sharpness in his gaze, a quiet intensity that replaced his previous carefree demeanor. He was no longer content to merely observe the world or lose himself in private literary daydreams. The injustices stamped into his memory demanded an outlet, and his immediate priority was to finish his medical degree so he could free himself from academic obligations and return to the wider world. Working with a fierce, concentrated urgency, Ernesto threw himself into his medical studies with unprecedented determination. He studied late into the night, racing through his remaining examinations at a pace that astonished his professors. His primary motivation was no longer the traditional pursuit of a respectable medical career or the acquisition of professional status. Rather, medicine had become a tool, a passport that would allow him to travel freely, secure employment in remote regions, and continue his intimate connection with the poor and marginalized. By March 1953, at the age of 24, Ernesto officially graduated as a doctor of medicine. Yet the traditional path of setting up a private clinic in Buenos Aires held zero appeal for him. He felt an intense, restless pull away from Argentina, drawn irresistibly back toward the broader theater of Latin American social struggle, where the tectonic plates of politics, poverty, and foreign domination were beginning to grind together with alarming force. In July 1953, alongside his close friend Carlos Ferrer, Ernesto embarked on his second major journey northward, leaving Buenos Aires behind with a one-way train ticket toward Bolivia. This trip lacked the light-hearted romance of the motorcycle journey. It was marked from the start by a sober, intellectual quest to understand the mechanics of political power and social transformation. Arriving in La Paz, Bolivia, Ernesto and Ferrer stepped into a nation currently undergoing a historic national revolution led by the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario, or MNR. The Bolivian National Revolution of 1952 had exploded with massive popular uprisings of tin miners and peasants who had seized land and weapons, overthrowing the traditional oligarchy. For Ernesto, this was a living laboratory of social upheaval. He spent days walking through the dusty streets of La Paz, observing the fervent demonstrations, talking with radicalized miners, and analyzing the complex dynamics of a popular revolution in motion. He witnessed the profound pride of the indigenous population, who for the first time were tasting political agency. Yet he also developed a sharp, critical eye regarding the limitations of reformist governments that attempted to transform society without dismantling the underlying economic structures of imperialism. From Bolivia, Ernesto continued his solitary northward trek through Peru, Ecuador, and eventually into Central America, arriving in the vibrant and volatile nation of Guatemala in December 1953. At this precise historical moment, Guatemala was the epicenter of intense political hope and international tension throughout the hemisphere. Under the democratically elected government of President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, the country was undertaking a sweeping and radical agrarian reform program. For years, massive tracts of fertile agricultural land had been monopolized by foreign corporate monopolies, most notably the powerful United Fruit Company, which treated the Central American nation as a private corporate fiefdom. The Arbenz administration dared to challenge this dominance by expropriating uncultivated land from the foreign corporation and redistributing it to impoverished, landless Mayan peasants. For Ernesto, who had witnessed the landless misery of the indigenous peoples across the Andes, Guatemala represented the bright dawn of a new anti-imperialist era. Settling into a modest boarding house in Guatemala City, Ernesto immersed himself completely in the intellectual and political ferment of the capital. Because his medical degree was not immediately recognized in Guatemala, he struggled financially, scraping by on meager earnings from odd jobs, selling medical articles, and living a bohemian existence among a community of exiled revolutionaries, radical intellectuals, artists, and leftist activists from all over Latin America. It was during these intense months in Guatemala that Ernesto's political education crystallized into a firm, uncompromising worldview. He spent countless hours in cafes and smoky apartments debating the theories of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and anti-imperialist thinkers. He read voraciously, digesting economic texts, historical analyses of capital and political tracts, systematically building the theoretical framework that would underpin his future actions. The transition from a compassionate observer of human suffering to a dedicated student of revolutionary socialism was now essentially complete. He came to firmly believe that poverty and exploitation were not accidental failures of local governance, but the deliberate, systemic products of international capitalism and American economic domination. In Guatemala, Ernesto also crossed paths with a remarkable circle of political exiles who would shape his destiny. Among them was Hilda Guedia, a brilliant, politically sophisticated Peruvian economist and activist belonging to the American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, or APRA. Hilda possessed a deep understanding of Marxist theory and Latin American sociology, and she became Ernesto's intellectual mentor, lover, and companion during these turbulent months. Through Hilda, he was introduced to leading leftist intellectuals, government officials, and exiled activists from across the continent. It was also in Guatemala that he earned a nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life and transform into a global symbol, Che, an Argentine conversational interjection he used constantly, which his Central American and Caribbean friends adopted as his moniker. However, the grand experiment of the Guatemalan Revolution was destined for a violent and tragic collision with geopolitical reality. During the height of the Cold War, the United States government and the CIA viewed the Arbenz administration's land reforms and its modest tolerance of local communists as an unacceptable communist threat in its traditional backyard. Washington orchestrated a covert operation codenamed PB Success, organizing, arming, and financing a mercenary invasion force led by the exiled Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, while launching an aggressive campaign of economic sabotage, psychological warfare, and aerial bombardments against Guatemala City. Ernesto watched with mounting fury and disillusionment as the democratic government of Arbenz hesitated, refused to arm the civilian population and worker militias, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of the U.S.-backed invasion in June 1954. For Che Guevara, the fall of Guatemala was a profound and permanent psychological turning point. He had volunteered to organize medical brigades, joined youth defense committees, and prepared to fight if necessary, experiencing firsthand the terror of air raids and the chaos of a collapsing state. The lesson he drew from the catastrophe was stark, unforgiving, and absolute. Reformist governments that attempted to challenge foreign corporate power through peaceful democratic means, while leaving the old military apparatus and state structures intact, were doomed to be crushed. Imperialism could not be negotiated with or reformed. It had to be met with armed force, revolutionary violence, and total popular mobilization, with the democratic dreams of Guatemala reduced to ashes and a bounty placed on his head by the new military dictatorship. Che took refuge in the Argentine embassy before managing to secure safe passage out of the country, boarding a steamship bound for Mexico. He left Central America no longer just a wandering doctor with radical ideas, but a hardened, revolutionary militant ready for war. The steamship journey from Central America deposited Ernesto Guevara into the vast, vibrant, and politically charged atmosphere of Mexico City in the autumn of 1954. Mexico had long maintained a proud tradition of political asylum, serving as a haven for exiles, dreamers, and dissidents from every corner of Latin America. For Ernesto, arriving in this bustling metropolis marked the beginning of a challenging chapter filled with poverty, uncertainty, and relentless intellectual searching. He was penniless, jobless, and still carrying the bitter emotional residue of the CIA-backed coup that had crushed the democratic hopes of Guatemala just weeks earlier. Finding a modest, cramped room, he scraped by through a series of precarious odd jobs, working as a street photographer, selling books, and eventually securing a position as a researcher and medical assistant at the General Hospital of Mexico City and the Autonomous University of Mexico. Despite the daily struggle to pay for food and rent, he dedicated his free time to expanding his political network, seeking out fellow exiles, and discussing the lessons of the Guatemalan defeat. It was during these early months of struggle in Mexico City that Ernesto crossed paths with Hilda Gadia once again. Hilda had also managed to escape Guatemala following the collapse of the Arbenz government, and her reunion with Ernesto brought a sense of stability and intellectual companionship to his difficult exile. They renewed their romantic relationship, sharing a tiny apartment where political debate, Marxist literature, and discussions about the future of Latin America filled the smoky air. Through Hilda and other Peruvian and Central American exiles, Ernesto immersed himself deeper into the émigré circles of Mexico City, listening to endless analyses of why reformist movements failed and how future revolutionary efforts could avoid the fatal mistakes of the past. Yet, despite his deep involvement in these political circles, he remained an outsider looking for a concrete path forward, an instrument capable of translating his revolutionary theories into actual armed struggle against tyranny. That turning point arrived on a warm evening in July 1955, at the home of Maria Antonia Gonzalez, a dedicated Cuban revolutionary exile whose apartment served as a safe house and meeting place for opponents of the brutal dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. Batista had seized power in a military coup in Havana in 1952, closing the Cuban Congress, suspending the Constitution, and aligning his corrupt regime closely with American corporate interests and organized crime syndicates. Among the Cuban exiles gathered in Mexico City was a charismatic, towering young lawyer named Fidel Castro. Fidel had recently been released from prison in Cuba following an amnesty after leading the disastrous yet symbolic assault on the Moncada barracks in July 1953. Undeterred by that defeat, Fidel had traveled to Mexico with a singular, unyielding obsession: to organize a new guerrilla army, return to Cuba by sea, launch an armed insurrection in the rugged mountains of the island, and overthrow the Batista dictatorship. When Ernesto Guevara and Fidel Castro met for the first time in that modest Mexico City apartment, it was an encounter of historic proportions that would alter the course of modern history. The conversation between the Argentine doctor and the Cuban revolutionary lasted deep into the night, stretching past dawn as they debated politics, philosophy, and military strategy. Fidel was immediately struck by Ernesto's sharp intellect, his profound knowledge of Marxist theory, and his unwavering commitment to continental revolution. Ernesto, in turn, was utterly captivated by Fidel's magnetic charisma, his boundless energy, his absolute self-confidence, and his fierce, practical determination to take immediate action rather than engage in endless academic debates. Unlike the cautious politicians Ernesto had encountered in Guatemala, Fidel possessed an infectious, strategic vision, and an iron will that convinced the young Argentine that here, finally, was a leader capable of forging a successful revolution. By the end of that first marathon conversation, the bond between the two men was firmly cemented. Fidel outlined his plans for a clandestine expedition to Cuba, and Ernesto, despite suffering from chronic, debilitating asthma attacks that frequently left him gasping for air, immediately volunteered to join the movement. He did not sign up as a political ally or a foreign observer. He offered his services as a combatant and a military medic, ready to share every hardship and hazard of the coming struggle. Fidel accepted him into the clandestine group, which was rapidly taking shape as the 26th of July movement, named after the date of the historic Moncada attack. Life in Mexico City, for the members of the 26th of July movement, became an intense, clandestine routine of preparation, physical training, and fundraising. Ernesto balanced his meager income from medical work and photography with long hours spent marching through the rugged, pine-covered mountains surrounding Mexico City. Under the grueling instruction of Alberto Bayo, a veteran Republican captain from the Spanish Civil War, the Cuban exiles and their few foreign volunteers underwent rigorous training in guerrilla warfare, jungle survival, weapons handling, and tactical combat. Bayo was a demanding, strict instructor who pushed his recruits to their absolute physical limits, teaching them the vital principles of surprise, mobility, and self-reliance that would define their future campaign. Throughout these punishing marches, Ernesto pushed his frail, asthmatic body relentlessly, refusing to lag behind his comrades, earning their deep respect through his stubborn endurance and quiet courage. As the months passed, the circle of conspirators grew tighter, drawing in diverse figures united by their hatred of the Batista dictatorship and their desire for social justice in Cuba. Alongside Fidel and Ernesto were other passionate revolutionaries, including Fidel's brother Raul Castro, Camilo Cienfuegos, and a network of underground supporters in Mexico and Cuba who smuggled funds, weapons, and intelligence. During this turbulent period of preparation, Ernesto's personal life also underwent a major transformation. He married Hilda Gadia in September 1955, and the following year they welcomed the birth of their daughter, Hilda Beatriz. Yet, even as he embraced fatherhood, Ernesto's mind remained entirely consumed by the impending expedition. He spent his days treating patients, studying military history, and discussing revolutionary theory, while his nights were dedicated to the secretive logistics of the movement. By the middle of 1956, the Mexican authorities, alerted by Cuban intelligence and diplomatic pressure, began cracking down on the underground activities of Castro's group. Several safe houses were raided, and Fidel Castro, along with Ernesto and several other key members, were briefly arrested by the Mexican Federal Police. Interrogated and detained, the revolutionaries faced the constant threat of deportation back to Cuba or imprisonment, which would have shattered the movement before it even began. However, through a combination of clever legal maneuvering, bribery, and financial support from sympathetic Mexican politicians and intellectuals, Fidel and his comrades were eventually released after spending weeks behind bars. The brief imprisonment only heightened their sense of urgency and resolve, proving that time was running out and that the Mexican sanctuary was becoming dangerously precarious. Released from detention, Ernesto redoubled his efforts, knowing that the training phase was drawing to a close and that the moment of truth was rapidly approaching. The secret preparations shifted toward acquiring a dilapidated, overloaded yacht capable of transporting the entire guerrilla force across the Gulf of Mexico. Ernesto packed his medical supplies, his worn notebooks, and his meager belongings, bidding a poignant farewell to his young wife and infant daughter as the shadows of secrecy deepened over Mexico City. The intellectual wandering that had carried him from the streets of Rosario across the length of South America and through the fallen democracy of Guatemala had finally brought him to the threshold of war. He was no longer merely a witness to the tragedies of Latin America. He was an active participant preparing to board a vessel that would sail directly into the heart of history. The autumn air in Tuxpan, a quiet port town along the Mexican Gulf Coast, hung heavy with secrecy, salt, and the quiet tension of an enterprise about to cross the line from conspiracy into reality. For weeks, Fidel Castro and his closest comrades had worked with frantic, exhausting urgency to secure a means of transport that could carry their rebel force across the sea to the shores of Cuba. Money was scarce, raised through meager donations, sympathizers, and the sale of whatever personal items the revolutionaries could spare. Finally, through a web of clandestine contacts, they acquired an old, weathered, second-hand diesel yacht named the Granma. Built originally for pleasure cruising, the aging vessel was structurally battered, sluggish, and profoundly ill-suited for the treacherous waters of the open sea, let alone for carrying an overloaded human cargo of armed insurgents, heavy wooden crates of weapons, ammunition, and survival supplies. Yet it was the only vessel available, and for Fidel, Ernesto Guevara, and the 81 men packed onto its decks, it represented the bridge to destiny. In the dead of night, under the cover of a heavy coastal fog, and shielded from the watchful eyes of local harbor authorities and informants, the Granma slipped quietly away from its dock and nosed out into the dark waters of the Tuxpan River, heading toward the Gulf of Mexico. The departure was chaotic, hurried, and fraught with peril from the very beginning. The yacht was designed to accommodate a fraction of the passengers now crowding its cramped hull and narrow decks, and the immense weight of the men, gear, and fuel boxes caused the vessel to sit dangerously low in the water. Ernesto Guevara, wearing his usual worn clothing and carrying his medical kit alongside his rifle, squeezed into the stifling, claustrophobic compartments below deck, feeling the immediate onset of the heavy, rolling swell of the sea. Within hours of clearing the coast, the fragile stability of the expedition began to fracture under the brutal assault of a severe winter storm that swept down across the Gulf. The voyage quickly turned into a prolonged nightmare of physical suffering and mechanical failure. The Granma was not built to withstand the towering waves and fierce gales of the open sea, and its groaning engine labored desperately against the relentless currents. Water leaked constantly into the hull, threatening to swamp the vessel and submerge the ammunition stores. The overwhelming majority of the men on board, accustomed to dry land or short coastal crossings, were immediately struck down by violent, unyielding seasickness. The cramped lower decks transformed into a chaotic chamber of human misery, filled with the stifling stench of diesel fumes, vomit, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Men vomited helplessly into corners, clutching their stomachs as the yacht pitched violently from side to side, rising vertically on crests of dark water before plunging sickeningly into deep troughs. For Ernesto Guevara, who was already battling chronic, severe asthma, the conditions on the yacht were nothing short of agonizing. The humid, foul air below deck irritated his bronchial tubes, triggering persistent, exhausting coughing fits that left him gasping for air in the suffocating darkness. Despite his own physical torment, Ernesto refused to remain idle or retreat into self-pity. Clawing his way up onto the rocking deck whenever he could manage, he forced his trembling body to move among his suffering comrades, distributing basic remedies, offering words of encouragement, and tending to those worst affected by the rolling waves and motion sickness. His background as a doctor made him an invaluable psychological anchor for the desperate men around him, many of whom were terrified, cold, and desperately questioning whether their idealistic mission would end in drowning before they even caught a glimpse of the Cuban coast. Compounding the disaster of the storm, the expedition faced a terrifying loss of essential equipment during the height of the gales. In the violent tossing of the waves, heavy crates containing vital rifles, ammunition belts, and medical supplies broke free from their lashings on deck and slid violently overboard into the dark, churning depths of the Gulf. The loss of these weapons was a devastating blow to a guerrilla force that was already poorly equipped, reducing their military capability before they had even set foot on enemy soil. To make matters worse, the yacht's aging radio equipment failed completely, cutting them off from any contact with their underground support networks in Cuba, who were anxiously waiting to coordinate local uprisings to coincide with their arrival. Days melted into an agonizing blur of gray skies, freezing spray, exhaustion, and relentless motion. The engine sputtered and coughed, threatening to die altogether, while the navigational instruments on board proved increasingly unreliable, leaving the pilots struggling blindly to calculate their precise position. Food supplies spoiled or soaked through with seawater, leaving the men to survive on meager, stale rations of dry biscuits and sips of foul-tasting water from rusted metal drums. Yet, amid the despair and physical exhaustion, a grim resilience took hold among the survivors. Fidel Castro remained outwardly calm and unshakable, pacing the cramped deck, studying maps by the dim light of a flashlight, and projecting an absolute, unyielding certainty that they would reach Cuba no matter the cost. By the early morning hours of December 2, 1956, after a grueling week of nightmare conditions at sea, the battered Granma finally approached the southern coast of Cuba. The original plan had been to land near the rugged region of Niquero in Orient Province, precisely timed to synchronize with an armed uprising in the nearby city of Santiago de Cuba, led by underground urban fighters under the command of Frank Pais. However, because of the severe delays caused by the storm, the heavy weight of the overloaded yacht, and navigational errors in the darkness, the vessel missed its intended landing spot by miles. Instead of reaching a deserted, welcoming beach where friendly local peasants could help them slip into the protective cover of the mountains, the Granma ran aground hard in a treacherous, tangled expanse of coastal swampland known as the Alegria de Pillo. The grounding was an immediate catastrophe. The yacht stuck fast in the thick, sucking mud and shallow water hundreds of meters away from dry land. There was no time to organize a stealthy disembarkation. Under the biting chill of the early morning darkness, the exhausted, shivering revolutionaries had to abandon the stranded vessel and plunge directly into the waist-deep brackish water of the swamp, wading through thick mangrove roots, clinging to their heavy rifles, and dragging their waterlogged backpacks behind them. Ernesto Guevara, his chest tight with asthma and his boots heavy with clinging mud, forced his exhausted legs forward through the swamp, leading a small group of stragglers toward the distant, solid line of shore. Reaching the dry land of the mangrove fringe brought little safety or relief. The landing had not gone unnoticed. Local coastal guards and informants had already alerted the military forces of the Batista dictatorship, who were swiftly mobilizing across the province. The element of surprise, which is the absolute lifeblood of any guerrilla insurgency, had been entirely shattered. The revolutionaries were scattered, wet, exhausted, and hopelessly disoriented in unfamiliar terrain, with government aircraft already beginning to circle overhead in search of the invading force. It was in these desperate, chaotic hours following the disastrous landing at Las Coloradas that Ernesto Guevara completed his definitive metamorphosis. The idealistic young doctor who had wandered across South America observing poverty and injustice, the intellectual who had debated Marxist theory in the smoky cafes of Mexico City, was gone. Standing in the dense, tangled undergrowth of the Cuban thicket, listening to the distant drone of enemy patrol planes and the chilling sound of military truck engines drawing closer along the coastal roads, Ernesto made a fateful choice that would seal his historical identity. When a wounded comrade dropped a heavy box of ammunition into the swamp muck, shouting out a choice between saving the medical supplies or saving the bullets, Ernesto dropped his medical bag without hesitation and picked up the discarded ammunition crates. In that split-second decision, the physician officially laid down his healing instruments and picked up the rifle of the guerrilla fighter, stepping fully into the brutal, historic arena of armed revolution from which there would be no turning back. The dense, tropical canopy of the Sierra Maestra Mountains rose like a formidable green fortress above the sun-drenched plains of eastern Cuba. For the bewildered and exhausted survivors of the Granma expedition, those jagged peaks represented the difference between life and total destruction. Following the catastrophic surprise attack at Alegria de Pio, where the revolutionary column had been shattered, scattered, and hunted by the relentless forces of the Batista dictatorship, the remnants of the rebel army had managed to slip away into the labyrinthine wilderness. Out of the original 82 men who had crowded onto the small yacht just days before, only a tiny, battered nucleus of a dozen or so fighters had successfully reunited in the hidden folds of the mountains. They were hungry, physically broken, short on ammunition, and entirely cut off from the outside world. Yet, in this wild and unforgiving sanctuary, the rebellion did not die. Instead, it began to forge its unbreakable spirit. Ernesto Guevara arrived in the Sierra Maestra carrying the heavy physical and emotional scars of the initial defeat. His boots were worn to shreds, his clothes were torn into rags by the razor-sharp thorns of the undergrowth, and his chronic asthma flared up continuously under the damp, high-altitude mountain air and the rigorous exertion of daily climbs. There were moments during those early, desperate weeks when the physical toll seemed almost insurmountable. Yet, rather than yielding to despair, Ernesto threw himself into the harsh routine of guerrilla survival. He learned how to ration meager sips of water, how to identify edible plants in the jungle, and how to sleep for minutes at a time while leaning against the thick trunk of a cedar tree, cradling his rifle in his arms. The transition from a traveling intellectual and field doctor into a hardened guerrilla soldier was no longer a theoretical choice. It was an absolute daily necessity. Under the leadership of Fidel Castro, the small band slowly re-established contact with local peasants, underground sympathizers, and couriers operating in the valleys below. Slowly, cautiously, new recruits began to filter up the mountain trails, young men and women from nearby towns and farms who were drawn to the romantic and daring promise of armed resistance against the corrupt dictatorship. As the rebel numbers began to grow from a handful of fugitives into a small, organized fighting force, the need for rigid discipline, structure, and command became paramount. Fidel recognized Ernesto's unwavering dedication, sharp intellect, and absolute fearlessness, appointing him as one of the trusted commanders of the newly forming guerrilla columns. In the months that followed, Ernesto transformed from a quiet foreign volunteer into a commanding authority within the encampment. Life in the Sierra Maestra was defined by a relentless rhythm of movement, concealment, and preparation. The rebels rarely stayed in one place for more than a few days, constantly shifting their hidden camps along steep ridges and deep river valleys to evade the relentless sweeps of Batista's army and the overhead reconnaissance planes that buzzed the mountain skies like angry hornets. Ernesto quickly adapted to this nomadic existence, earning a reputation among his comrades as a strict, demanding, and fiercely principled commander. He tolerated no laziness, cowardice, or indiscipline, believing that the moral integrity of the rebel army was just as important as its military capability. At the same time, he maintained a deep, quiet empathy for the ordinary peasants of the region, treating their grievances with genuine respect, and ensuring that his men never stole from or mistreated the local population upon whom their survival depended. Despite his military duties and the constant threat of combat, Ernesto never completely abandoned his medical background. Whenever the column paused in a secure clearing, he would unpack his makeshift medical kit to treat not only wounded rebels suffering from bullet grazes and tropical infections, but also local peasant families who lived in extreme poverty in the remote mountain settlements. He treated children for parasitic worms, set broken bones, and distributed whatever scarce medicines they had managed to salvage. These acts of compassion bridged the cultural gap between the urban revolutionaries and the rural mountain folk, transforming the Sierra Maestra communities from suspicious onlookers into fiercely loyal allies who served as scouts, informants, and suppliers for the expanding insurgency. As the months rolled forward into 1957, the rebel presence in the mountains evolved from a desperate fugitive band into an active, aggressive military threat. Ernesto participated in the planning and execution of the guerrillas' very first successful armed raids against small military outposts scattered along the mountain fringes. These early skirmishes were small in scale, but they carried immense psychological and practical value. The rebels learned the art of ambush, striking swiftly from the dense foliage, capturing much-needed rifles and ammunition, and melting back into the impenetrable mountain mists before the heavier government reinforcements could arrive. Ernesto proved to be calm under fire, analyzing tactical errors with a cool, analytical mind, and constantly studying military theory from books smuggled up into the camp. Within the command structure of the Sierra Maestra, a close and complex bond developed between Ernesto and Fidel Castro. While Fidel was the charismatic visionary, the master orator, and the supreme political strategist of the revolution, Ernesto served as his most reliable ideological sounding board and an unyielding executor of his commands. They spent long, candle-lit nights talking about the future of Cuba, debating Marxist philosophy, imperialism, social justice, and the mechanics of revolutionary change. Ernesto admired Fidel's boundless energy and iron will, while Fidel respected Ernesto's uncompromising commitment and intellectual rigor. Their partnership became the twin engine driving the entire revolutionary project forward. By late 1957, the Sierra Maestra had been transformed into a liberated zone, a state within a state where the writ of the Batista dictatorship no longer ran. The rebels established underground printing presses to churn out revolutionary newspapers, set up secret radio transmitters to broadcast news of their victories across the island, and built a rudimentary infrastructure of schools and field hospitals. Ernesto took charge of organizing these internal supply lines and educational efforts, recognizing that a true revolution had to build a new society, even as it fought to destroy the old one. His leadership style combined intellectual theory with gritty, boots-on-the-ground pragmatism, inspiring deep loyalty among the growing ranks of guerrillas under his direct command. Yet, the dangers surrounding the mountain stronghold remained acute. Batista's military commanders launched massive, coordinated offensives aimed at crushing the rebellion once and for all, deploying thousands of well-armed troops backed by heavy artillery, naval blockades, and aerial bombardment. The rebels were frequently outnumbered and outgunned, forced to rely on superior local knowledge, mobility, and sheer psychological grit to survive the encircling sweeps. During these intense military campaigns, Ernesto's column held strategic passes and mountain flanks, fighting grueling holding actions that tested the limits of human endurance. Through hunger, exhaustion, heavy artillery fire, and the constant threat of betrayal, Ernesto stood shoulder to shoulder with his men, sharing every hardship without special privilege. By the end of this foundational period in the Sierra Maestra, Ernesto Guevara was no longer merely a participant in the Cuban Revolution. He was its defining military and intellectual pillar. The damp mountain trails, the smoky campfires, the endless marches through torrential tropical downpours, and the baptism of fire in mountain ambushes had forged him into a master guerrilla commander. The boy from Rosario who had dreamed of wandering across distant horizons had found his true historical purpose in the rugged, defiant peaks of eastern Cuba, standing ready for the sweeping national campaign that would soon break out of the mountains and change the course of Latin American history forever. The year 1958 marked the decisive turning point for the Cuban Revolution, transforming the protracted guerrilla struggle in the mountains into a sweeping national offensive that would ultimately shatter the foundations of the Batista dictatorship. For over a year, the ragged columns of the 26th of July movement had held their ground in the rugged fastnesses of the Sierra Maestra, resisting massive military sweeps, securing liberated zones, and winning the quiet allegiance of the rural peasantry. Yet, as the calendar turned and the cracks within the regime grew wider, Fidel Castro and his top commanders understood that the time had come to expand the war beyond the mountains and take the fight to the plains, the cities, and the coastal highways of the entire island. Ernesto Guevara, now hardened by countless skirmishes, chronic asthma attacks, and the harsh realities of mountain warfare, stood ready to play a leading role in this final, dramatic phase of the conflict. In the spring of 1958, Batista launched his final, desperate offensive, known operationally as Operation General Summer, mobilizing thousands of heavily armed government troops, tanks, and aircraft to crush the rebel stronghold once and for all. It was the most dangerous moment of the entire war for the insurgents. The government forces moved in slow, methodical pincer movements, hoping to squeeze the rebel army against the high peaks and annihilate them with superior firepower. But the guerrillas, utilizing their deep knowledge of the terrain, expert camouflage, and lightning-fast mobility, turned the offensive into a prolonged war of attrition. Ernesto commanded a vital sector of the mountain defense, coordinating ambush points, managing dwindling ammunition supplies, and keeping the morale of his men high through sheer personal example. When the government offensive finally bogged down in the mud, tropical rain, and relentless rebel harassment, the initiative shifted permanently. The Batista army had spent its strength, and the myth of its invulnerability was shattered forever. Following the defeat of the summer offensive, Fidel Castro issued orders for the rebel forces to break out of the Sierra Maestra and carry the revolution westward toward the central plains and provinces of Cuba. This was a bold and risky strategic move. To reach the central provinces of Las Villas, the rebel columns would have to march hundreds of kilometers across open terrain, flat sugarcane fields, and heavily patrolled highways, constantly exposed to enemy aircraft and armored patrols. Fidel selected his most trusted and capable commanders to lead these flying columns. Camilo Cienfuegos, the charismatic and daring fighter known as the hero of Yaguaje, was given command of one column, while Ernesto Guevara was appointed to lead the other, designated as Column No. 8 Cerro Redondo. This assignment marked a monumental milestone in Ernesto's life. The Argentinian doctor who had arrived in Cuba as an ideological volunteer and field medic was now trusted with leading a strategic military force across hostile territory to help liberate the heartland of the country. On August 31, 1958, Ernesto's column began its legendary march westward. The journey was an epic test of endurance, willpower, and tactical cunning. For nearly 2 months, Column No. 8 moved by night, resting in dense thickets and sugarcane fields by day, dodging enemy patrols, crossing swollen rivers, and enduring agonizing hunger and exhaustion. Ernesto's chronic asthma flared up severely under the strain of the forced night marches, and there were times when he had to be carried on horseback or assisted by his loyal comrades. Yet his fierce determination never wavered. He maintained strict discipline within the ranks, strictly forbidding any mistreatment of the local rural population, and ensuring that the column paid for any food or supplies they requisitioned. This code of conduct earned them the respect and protection of the peasants along the route, who acted as vital scouts, guides, and informants, shielding the column from the searching eyes of Batista's military intelligence. By mid-October, Ernesto's column successfully reached the mountainous region of the Escambray Mountains in the central province of Las Villas. This area was already home to other anti-government guerrilla groups, including the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil and local anti-Batista fighters. Integrating these disparate factions under a unified command structure was a delicate and complex political challenge that required all of Ernesto's growing diplomatic and leadership skills. Through patience, ideological clarity, and absolute personal courage, he gradually forged a cohesive fighting front that could challenge the government's control over the entire central province. The rebels began cutting telephone lines, blowing up strategic railway bridges, derailing military supply trains, and isolating the heavily fortified government garrisons in the towns and cities. The strategy in Las Villas was designed to paralyze the economic and military communications of the regime, cutting the island in half and preventing Batista from reinforcing his units in the east or the west. Ernesto proved to be a master of unconventional warfare, organizing daring night attacks on small rural garrisons, capturing vital weaponry, and turning the local civilian population into an active network of resistance. His command style in the Escambray was demanding and austere. He lived precisely as his men did, eating the same meager rations, sleeping on the ground, and sharing every hardship. At the same time, he established clandestine schools in the liberated areas, set up makeshift field hospitals, and published revolutionary newspapers to explain the political goals of the movement to the local inhabitants, ensuring that the military struggle went hand in hand with social transformation. As December arrived, the final act of the revolutionary drama began to unfold across Cuba. In the province of Las Villas, Ernesto prepared for his most daring and consequential military operation. The capture of Santa Clara, the capital city of the province and a crucial strategic hub, located just a few hours' drive from Havana. Santa Clara was heavily defended by thousands of government troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and an armored military train sent directly from the capital to reinforce the local garrison. If the rebels could capture Santa Clara, the highway and railway link between the east and west of the country would be completely severed, dealing a fatal blow to the regime's military capacity and morale. On the morning of December 28, 1958, Ernesto's forces, numbering only around 300 poorly equipped guerrillas, entered the outskirts of Santa Clara and launched their assault. What followed was a fierce, chaotic, and bloody urban battle that lasted for several days. The rebels fought house to house, utilizing Molotov cocktails, rifles, and captured weaponry against the superior firepower of the government forces. The civilian population of Santa Clara rallied immediately to the side of the insurgents, opening their homes to serve as sniper nests, carrying ammunition through crossfire, providing food, and tending to the wounded in makeshift clinics set up in basements and churches. Ernesto directed the battle from the front lines, moving from position to position under heavy gunfire, coolly assessing tactical developments, and encouraging his exhausted fighters. The climax of the Battle of Santa Clara, and indeed, one of the most famous military events of the entire Cuban Revolution, occurred on the afternoon of December 29, when Ernesto led a daring operation to derail the government's heavily armored military train. The train, carrying hundreds of elite troops, heavy machine guns, and vast quantities of ammunition and supplies, had been sent to crush the rebel defense. Using a stolen bulldozer commandeered from a nearby university agricultural school, Ernesto and his men managed to tear up the railway tracks just as the armored train approached a steep embankment. The train derailed, plunging several cars off the tracks and trapping the government soldiers inside a rolling steel fortress under a hail of rebel fire and Molotov cocktails. Trapped and demoralized, the commander of the armored train surrendered within hours, handing over an immense cache of modern weapons and ammunition that instantly tipped the military balance decisively in favor of the insurgents. By December 30, the greater part of Santa Clara was under rebel control, and the remaining government garrisons were surrounded, demoralized, and cut off from any hope of reinforcement. Word of the fall of Santa Clara spread like wildfire across the island, triggering panic in Havana and causing the high command of the military to lose all hope. In the early hours of January 1, 1959, realizing that the military situation was completely untenable and that the people had turned overwhelmingly against his rule, dictator Fulgencio Batista packed his closest associates and stolen wealth onto a private plane and fled the country into exile. The decades of tyranny had finally collapsed under the relentless pressure of the revolutionary offensive. When news of Batista's flight reached the front lines in Santa Clara, an electric wave of jubilation swept through the ranks of the rebel fighters and the exhausted civilian population. Ernesto, dusty, exhausted, and wearing his battle-stained guerrilla fatigues, immediately prepared his column for the final advance toward the capital. On January 2, 1959, receiving orders from Fidel Castro, Ernesto Guevara and his fellow commander Camilo Cienfuegos led their victorious columns out of Las Villas and marched triumphantly toward Havana. The journey was a continuous celebration, with thousands of cheering citizens lining the highways, waving makeshift red and black flags, throwing flowers, and chanting slogans of victory. For Ernesto, the long, arduous road from the remote classrooms of Rosario through the dusty trails of South American poverty, the dark jungles of the Sierra Maestra, and the bloody streets of Santa Clara had culminated in total historical transformation. The guerrilla fighter who had lived in the dirt and shadows of the mountains was now entering the capital as a conqueror and a national hero, standing at the threshold of a completely new era in Latin American history. The triumph of January 1959 brought an abrupt end to years of armed rebellion, replacing the chaos of guerrilla warfare with the urgent, daunting task of building a new society from the ground up. For Ernesto Guevara, the transition from military commander to state administrator was swift and relentless. The dusty fatigues and combat boots were not entirely discarded, but they were now worn in the corridors of power, inside government offices, and across national industrial complexes. Cuba was free from the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, but freedom alone could not feed the population, stabilize the currency, or break the deep structural dependence on foreign powers. Ernesto understood that the revolution had entered its most critical and difficult phase, the construction of a socialist state. In the immediate aftermath of the victory, the revolutionary leadership faced an economy in shambles, depleted foreign reserves, high unemployment, and widespread public expectation for rapid social reforms. Fidel Castro quickly recognized Ernesto's sharp intellect, absolute incorruptibility, and fierce dedication to the cause, appointing him to a series of increasingly influential positions. Ernesto was granted Cuban citizenship by birth in recognition of his vital role in the war, a unique legal status created specifically for foreign-born fighters who had led the insurrection. Soon after, he was named head of the Department of Industrialization, of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform INRI, and by late 1959, he was appointed president of the National Bank of Cuba. For a man whose formal training was in medicine and whose practical experience was limited to guerrilla combat, managing the central bank of an entire nation was an extraordinary challenge, approached with characteristic intensity and late-night study. As president of the National Bank, Ernesto found himself plunged into complex monetary theories, trade negotiations, and fiscal policies. Legend has it that, when he was first offered the post, he jokingly asked if there was an economist in the room, having misheard Fidel's request for a communist, though he quickly set to work reading massive volumes of economic theory by Marx, Keynes, and classical economists to master the intricacies of finance. One of his most symbolic and humorous acts during his tenure at the National Bank was his signature on Cuban banknotes. Instead of signing his full name, he simply scrawled Che, a deliberate and egalitarian gesture that reflected his rejection of formal bourgeois titles and his desire to remain close to the ordinary working people. Beneath the symbolic gestures, however, lay profound economic realities. Cuba's economy had long been dominated by a single export, sugar, and tightly tethered to the economic orbit of the United States. American corporations owned vast tracts of agricultural land, public utilities, oil refineries, and mines on the island. Ernesto argued fiercely that true political independence was an illusion without economic sovereignty. Under his guidance, the revolutionary government embarked on sweeping agrarian reform, breaking up massive latifundia, large estates, and distributing land to tenant farmers and rural laborers. Simultaneously, the state began the process of nationalizing foreign-owned properties, banks, and major industries. These bold moves were met with increasing hostility from Washington, which viewed the radicalization of the Cuban Revolution as a direct threat to its geopolitical and economic interests in Latin America. The confrontation with the United States accelerated the transformation of Cuba's domestic and foreign policies. When American oil refineries in Cuba refused to process crude oil purchased from the Soviet Union, the revolutionary government responded by nationalizing the refineries. Washington retaliated by cutting off Cuba's lucrative sugar quota, threatening to strangle the island's economy. Ernesto played a central role in navigating this economic crisis, traveling extensively to socialist bloc countries, including the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, China, and North Korea, to secure vital trade agreements, purchase industrial machinery, and arrange for the exchange of Cuban sugar for Soviet oil, grain, and manufactured goods. These missions transformed Ernesto from a local rebel leader into an international statesman of the emerging socialist world. Within Cuba, Ernesto threw himself into the monumental effort of industrialization and labor mobilization. He believed that the construction of a new society required not only structural economic changes, but also a profound transformation of human consciousness. He rejected the capitalist reliance on material incentives alone, arguing that a true socialist worker should be motivated by a sense of social duty, solidarity, and collective responsibility. To put these ideals into practice, he led by personal example, participating in voluntary labor campaigns on weekends. Armed with a machete, Ernesto could frequently be found sweating alongside dock workers, cutting sugarcane in the fields, or working assembly lines in newly nationalized factories. These weekend volunteer shifts became a powerful symbol of revolutionary commitment, inspiring thousands of young Cubans, intellectuals, and urban workers to follow his lead. As Minister of Industries, a post he assumed in February 1961, Ernesto oversaw the centralization and planned reorganization of the Cuban manufacturing sector. He sought to diversify the economy away from its historical monoculture, pushing for rapid industrialization, the construction of factories, and the development of domestic manufacturing capabilities. However, these ambitious plans encountered severe obstacles. Cuba lacked the necessary domestic technological base, skilled labor, and raw materials to sustain rapid industrialization in isolation. Furthermore, the tightening U.S. trade embargo, formalized as a near-total economic blockade, created chronic shortages of spare parts, machinery, and essential goods. Factories struggled to maintain production, and the centralized planning system often resulted in bureaucratic inefficiencies, bottlenecks, and distribution failures that frustrated both workers and planners. Despite these mounting economic difficulties, Ernesto remained relentlessly dedicated to his vision of revolutionary morality. He engaged in fierce internal debates within the Cuban leadership regarding the best path for socialist economic development. While some officials favored replicating the centralized planning models and material incentive systems used in the Soviet Union, Ernesto argued passionately for a moral economy, warning that the adoption of capitalist-style incentives would corrupt the socialist spirit and create a new bureaucratic elite. He published influential essays, such as Socialism and Man in Cuba, in which he articulated his belief that the ultimate goal of the revolution was the creation of the new man, an ethical, selfless individual dedicated entirely to the collective good of humanity. By the mid-1960s, the pressures of governance, the complexities of managing a national economy under siege, and his persistent restlessness began to take a heavy toll. Ernesto was fundamentally a man of action and a soldier of the frontiers, increasingly uncomfortable with the sedentary life of an office administrator and the frustrating compromises of state bureaucracy. While he had successfully helped dismantle the old regime and lay the institutional foundations of the socialist state, his gaze was once again turning outward. He watched the ongoing struggles against colonialism and imperialism across the globe, in Vietnam, in the Congo, and throughout Latin America, and felt a growing conviction that his true place was not behind a desk in Havana, but back in the field, fighting on the front lines of the global revolution. As the boundaries of revolutionary Cuba began to stabilize, Ernesto Guevara's perspective expanded far beyond the Caribbean island, pulling him into the turbulent currents of international diplomacy and global politics. No longer confined to the day-to-day administration of factories and banks in Havana, Che emerged as a prominent roving ambassador for the Cuban Revolution. His unique status as an Argentine-born revolutionary fighter holding high-ranking Cuban state positions gave him an unprecedented platform on the world stage. He was sent abroad not merely to negotiate trade treaties, but to forge ideological alliances, challenge Western hegemony, and articulate the grievances of the developing world. Through a series of high-profile international travels and diplomatic missions, the world outside Latin America began to take serious notice of the fiery bearded commander and the audacious socialist experiment taking root just 90 miles from the United States. His diplomatic journeys took him across continents, bridging the ideological divides of the Cold War. In the early 1960s, Che embarked on extensive tours of the socialist bloc, visiting the Soviet Union, China, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, North Korea, and Yugoslavia. These visits were filled with official banquets, factory inspections, and tense ideological discussions behind closed doors. While Che deeply appreciated the economic and military aid provided by the Soviet Union and its allies to keep the beleaguered Cuban economy afloat, his relationship with the orthodox communist leadership was frequently strained. He was an uncompromising idealist who viewed the socialist world through the lens of revolutionary solidarity rather than bureaucratic pragmatism. During his travels in Beijing, he held cordial meetings with Mao Zedong and other Chinese leaders, seeking alternative models of agrarian revolution and peasant mobilization that resonated with his own guerrilla background. Yet, as the Sino-Soviet split deepened, Che struggled to maintain a delicate neutrality, striving always to keep Cuban independence paramount while accepting vital support from both communist superpowers. Beyond the socialist bloc, Che's diplomatic missions extended deep into the non-aligned world and nations fighting for decolonization in Africa and Asia. He visited countries such as Egypt, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Dahomey, and Indonesia, engaging with leaders of newly independent nations and anti-colonial liberation movements. These visits opened his eyes to the profound poverty and systemic exploitation facing the African continent, deepening his conviction that the struggle against imperialism was global and interconnected. He walked through bustling African markets, met with local workers and anti-colonial activists, and delivered passionate speeches denouncing the remnants of European colonialism. In these engagements, Che did not behave like a traditional, polished diplomat in a tailored suit. He traveled in his familiar olive green military fatigues, projecting the image of a permanent soldier of the revolution. His directness, lack of diplomatic pretense, and fierce anti-imperialist rhetoric captivated audiences abroad, earning him immense respect among radical youth and national liberation groups worldwide. The pinnacle of Che's international diplomatic career came during his appearances at major international forums, most notably the United Nations General Assembly in New York. In December 1964, Che traveled to the United States to address the United Nations, a high-stakes moment that placed a prominent revolutionary leader directly inside the heart of the capitalist superpower. Dressed in his crisp olive-green uniform, Che strode into the UN headquarters and delivered a landmark, blistering speech that reverberated across the globe. With sharp rhetoric and unwavering confidence, he denounced American imperialism, criticized the United Nations for failing to prevent armed interventions in the developing world, and defended Cuba's right to sovereign self-determination. He boldly declared solidarity with the peoples of Latin America, Africa, and Asia fighting against foreign domination, famously quoting a phrase that would become a rallying cry: "Where is the Yankee imperialism's claw? Wherever peoples are exploited, wherever sovereignty is violated, there it is." His speech electrified the anti-colonial movement and cemented his reputation as an uncompromising voice for the global oppressed. During his time in New York, Che's presence generated intense media scrutiny, public protests, and diplomatic security challenges. While American officials viewed him with hostility and alarm, ordinary citizens, civil rights activists, and left-wing intellectuals flocked to catch a glimpse of the legendary Cuban commander. In a dramatic incident during his visit, an anti-communist exile attempted to assassinate him outside the UN building, though the attack was thwarted by security personnel. Unfazed by the hostility, Che used every available media opportunity, appearing on television programs and granting interviews to journalists, to explain the motivations of the Cuban Revolution, and to argue that revolution in Latin America was not an export of Havana, but an inevitable response to intolerable social conditions. His sharp intellect, fluency in multiple issues, and calm demeanor under pressure left a lasting impression on international observers. Following his appearance at the United Nations, Che continued his journey with an extended tour of African nations, culminating in a historic address in Algiers in February 1965 at the Second Economic Seminar of Afro-Asian Solidarity. In what would become known as the Algiers speech, Che delivered his most radical critique of international economic relations to date. He did not reserve his criticisms solely for Western capitalist powers. He also directed sharp words at the socialist bloc, urging them to abandon terms of trade that mirrored capitalist exploitation, and demanding that industrialized socialist nations provide unconditional aid to impoverished countries fighting imperialism. He argued that the socialist countries had a moral obligation to act as a supportive rearguard for the anti-colonial struggles in the Third World. This speech marked a turning point in Che's political evolution, signaling that his revolutionary vision could no longer be contained within the borders of Cuba, or even within the conventional strategies of traditional communist parties. Che's international travels profoundly transformed his understanding of global geopolitics. He returned to Havana bearing a heavy burden of disillusionment regarding the willingness of established powers, including friendly socialist states, to sacrifice their own geopolitical interests for the sake of international revolution. He became increasingly convinced that revolutionary change could not be achieved through polite diplomatic negotiations, parliamentary politics, or reliance on foreign aid. Instead, he believed that the peoples of the developing world had to take up arms to shatter the chains of dependency through direct, armed struggle. His experiences abroad served as the ideological bridge between his role as a builder of the Cuban state and his final, fatal calling as a global apostle of guerrilla warfare. As Ernesto Guevara looked out over the vast and complex landscape of the international socialist movement during the early 1960s, he realized that winning political power in Cuba was merely a prologue. The deeper, more enduring task was understanding the mechanics of historical change and articulating a coherent theoretical framework that could guide the dispossessed of the earth toward liberation. For Che, theory was never an academic exercise conducted in quiet university libraries or secluded party offices. It was an urgent, living guide to action, forged in the muddy trenches of the Sierra Maestra, tested in the crucible of government ministries in Havana, and refined through relentless encounters with the harsh realities of global inequality. In the quiet hours between endless meetings, diplomatic travels, and late-night writing sessions in his office, Che poured his thoughts onto paper, crafting essays, pamphlets, and theoretical treatises that sought to redefine Marxist thought for the post-colonial 20th century. His writings became a cornerstone of what would come to be known as Guevarism, a distinct strain of revolutionary doctrine that placed armed struggle, moral incentives, and the creation of a new human consciousness at the very center of the socialist project. At the heart of Che's theoretical universe was an unshakable conviction that capitalism was not merely an inefficient economic system, but a profound moral failure that degraded humanity. He observed how the global capitalist machinery systematically extracted wealth from the nations of the global South, leaving behind exhausted soils, ruined local industries, and impoverished population whose labor subsidized the luxuries of the industrialized world. To Che, this relationship of dependency could never be reformed or negotiated away through gradualist parliamentary politics or electoral compromises. The entrenched power of domestic oligarchies, backed by the formidable military and economic might of foreign imperialism, left the oppressed with only one viable path to dignity: revolutionary violence aimed at shattering the existing state apparatus root and branch. He argued that waiting for the objective conditions of revolution to mature passively was a fatal mistake. Revolutionaries had to actively create those conditions through bold, exemplary armed struggle waged by committed vanguards operating among the rural peasantry. This core strategic concept found its most famous expression in Che's doctrine of Fuquismo, or the focal point theory of guerrilla warfare. Drawing heavily from the practical experience of the Cuban Revolution, Che and fellow theorist Regis Debray contended that a small, highly disciplined band of dedicated guerrilla fighters could establish a rural base in rugged terrain, demonstrate the vulnerability of the ruling regime, and catalyze broader popular support among marginalized populations. Unlike traditional Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, which traditionally waited for a mature urban proletariat to lead the revolutionary vanguard, Che argued that in many parts of Latin America, the countryside, where poverty was deepest and state control weakest, was the natural theater for revolutionary ignition. The guerrilla unit would act as a moral and political catalyst, awakening the latent revolutionary consciousness of the peasantry through acts of solidarity, land distribution, and relentless military pressure against the military outposts of the status quo. Yet Che was careful to emphasize that guerrilla warfare was primarily a political tool rather than a purely military endeavor. A guerrilla army, in his view, could only survive and triumph if it maintained an organic, deeply symbiotic relationship with the local civilian population. The fighters had to behave with exemplary discipline, respect local customs, provide medical care where the state had abandoned its people, and pay fairly for every single item requisitioned from local farmers. If a guerrilla unit lost the trust of the local community, it was doomed to isolation, military encirclement, and eventual destruction. Beyond military strategy and anti-imperialist economics, Che dedicated much of his later theoretical writing to the internal, spiritual transformation of human nature under socialism. He observed with growing alarm how traditional socialist states often relied heavily on material incentives, wage differentials, and bureaucratic controls to drive productivity, mirroring the capitalist mechanisms they ostensibly sought to transcend. Che rejected this pragmatic approach with characteristic moral fervor. He argued that building socialism without simultaneously transforming human consciousness was a dead end that would merely reproduce selfishness, alienation, and class stratification under a new red banner. He famously asserted that the ultimate aim of communism was just as much spiritual as it was material: to create the new man, an individual motivated not by personal enrichment, individual gain, or the accumulation of consumer goods, but by solidarity, collective well-being, a deep sense of social duty, and an unselfish love for humanity. In his classic essay Man and Socialism in Cuba, Che articulated this vision with poetic intensity, describing the revolutionary as someone whose actions are guided by great feelings of love for their fellow human beings, and who finds supreme fulfillment in contributing to the common struggle. He recognized that forging this new consciousness required a grueling, protracted cultural and ideological struggle, one that had to be fought daily in factories, schools, and community centers across the nation. Workers had to be encouraged to take part voluntarily in socialist emulation, dedicating extra hours of labor not for higher wages, but as a conscious contribution to the collective defense and development of the revolution. Che himself practiced what he preached, setting an uncompromising personal example by spending his weekends performing voluntary manual labor harvesting sugarcane in the fields or working shifts in industrial plants, refusing special privileges, and living a modest life alongside ordinary citizens. His theoretical framework also addressed the complex realities of building an anti-imperialist front on a global scale. He viewed the Soviet socialist bloc not as an infallible guide, but as a powerful rearguard that had a revolutionary duty to provide unconditional, unselfish aid to national liberation struggles across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Whenever he detected tendencies toward bureaucratic self-interest, peaceful coexistence with Western imperialism at the expense of Third World revolutionaries, or unequal trade terms within the socialist community, Che did not hesitate to voice sharp, principled criticisms. He warned that if the socialist countries became comfortable trading partners within the global capitalist market, they risked losing their revolutionary soul and abandoning the historic mission of global emancipation. His vision was unabashedly internationalist, rooted in the famous slogan that the duty of every revolutionary is to make the revolution, wherever imperialism reared its head. As Che's theoretical writings circulated globally, they were devoured by student movements, anti-colonial rebels, and radical intellectuals from Paris to Tokyo, who found in his words a passionate antidote to political cynicism and Cold War conformity. Even as critics pointed out the practical failures, heavy human costs, and strategic dead ends that sometimes accompanied attempts to replicate the Cuban model in vastly different geographical and political contexts, Che's theoretical legacy remained a powerful testament to an era when revolutionary idealism sought to redraw the map of the modern world. His ideas captured the imagination of millions who believed that human society could be fundamentally reorganized along lines of absolute justice, equality, and international solidarity. The triumphs of the early years of the Cuban Revolution had given way to heavy responsibilities, endless administrative meetings, and the complex daily grind of managing a state economy under a severe American trade embargo. For Ernesto Che Guevara, who had spent his youth wandering across the roads of South America and his young adulthood fighting in the rugged mountains of the Sierra Maestra, the quiet air-conditioned offices of Havana presented a profound internal challenge. He had proven himself as a guerrilla commander, a diplomat representing the new government abroad, and a minister directing industrialization and national banking. Yet, as the years progressed, Che found himself increasingly at odds with the emerging bureaucratic realities of state governance. He observed with growing frustration how administrative routines, ministerial red tape, and institutional inertia threatened to stifle the vibrant, spontaneous spirit of the revolution. While other leaders sought pragmatic compromises to manage the economy and navigate the treacherous waters of Cold War geopolitics, Che maintained an uncompromising ideological purity. He grew deeply troubled by signs of growing bureaucracy, administrative complacency, and a drift away from the radical internationalist ideals that had inspired the original rebel army. His sharp criticisms of trade practices within the socialist bloc, most famously expressed during his speech in Algiers in February 1965, highlighted his belief that revolutionary nations had a moral duty to provide unselfish, disinterested aid to impoverished peoples fighting against imperialism, rather than engaging in standard commercial transactions that mirrored capitalist inequality. Upon returning to Cuba from his extensive international tour across Africa and Asia, Che withdrew from public view for several months. Whispers and rumors swirled in international capitals regarding his sudden disappearance from the political scene. Some foreign commentators speculated about ideological purges, bitter falling outs with Fidel Castro, or sudden political disgrace. However, the truth was far more aligned with Che's unyielding personal character and his lifelong commitment to the concept of permanent revolution. He believed that his primary duty as a revolutionary was not to sit comfortably behind a mahogany desk in Havana, enjoying the titles and privileges of state power, but to be on the front lines where the struggle against imperialism was most acute. In a historic farewell letter written to Fidel Castro in the spring of 1965, which Castro later read publicly in October of that year, Che formally renounced all his government positions, his military rank, his honorary Cuban citizenship, and any formal ties to the state apparatus. He stated clearly that other nations of the world called for his modest efforts, and that while he left behind a pure heart and the memories of building a great people, he felt he had fulfilled his duty to the Cuban Revolution. With this profound and definitive gesture, Che quietly prepared to leave Cuba behind to take the flame of armed struggle to new continents, turning his gaze toward the liberation movements of the African continent, where he hoped to ignite the spark of anti-colonial resistance. The decision marked a dramatic turning point in his life, transitioning him from a high-ranking minister of a sovereign state back into a clandestine revolutionary warrior, ready to face new trials in unfamiliar and difficult lands. His first major destination, outside Latin America, was the tumultuous political landscape of Central Africa, specifically the newly independent Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was then caught in a devastating civil war and regional proxy conflicts following the assassination of its first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. The Congo occupied a crucial strategic position in the heart of Africa, and Che viewed it as the burning weak point in the imperialist chain, where a successful intervention could alter the balance of power across the entire continent. Operating under deep secrecy, Che and a small, disciplined contingent of Cuban volunteers crossed the Atlantic and entered the Congo by way of Tanzania, establishing clandestine training camps near the shores of Lake Tanganyika. They sought to assist the leftist followers of Patrice Lumumba, who were waging an insurgency against the central government and its foreign mercenaries. Yet, from the very beginning, the African mission was plagued by immense logistical nightmares, profound cultural and linguistic barriers, and severe organizational disarray among the local insurgent factions. Unlike the cohesive, ideologically unified peasant army he had known in the Sierra Maestra, the Congolese rebel commanders Che encountered were often fractured by deep tribal divisions, regional rivalries, and a disheartening lack of revolutionary discipline. Many of the local fighters proved reluctant to submit to the rigorous training regimens and political education that the Cuban veterans attempted to instill. Instead of engaging in coordinated guerrilla warfare against superior forces, local leaders frequently abandoned their positions, indulged in factional infighting, and showed a disturbing lack of commitment to the broader ideological goals of the struggle. Compounding these internal fractures were the harsh environmental realities of the Central African jungle, which presented relentless challenges to fighters unaccustomed to the oppressive humidity, tropical diseases, and scarce medical supplies. Malaria swept through the encampments, debilitating both Cuban volunteers and local recruits, while supplies of food, ammunition, and proper equipment were constantly delayed or intercepted by enemy forces. Despite these mounting obstacles, Che tried desperately to turn the tide. He marched alongside his men, shared their meager rations, treated the sick and wounded with his medical training, and attempted by sheer force of personal example to inspire discipline and courage in a hopeless environment. He spent months attempting to organize the disorganized rebel bands, holding long, frustrating meetings with fractious leaders who consistently promised unity, but delivered betrayal and division on the battlefield. The situation deteriorated further as government forces, backed by foreign mercenaries and Western intelligence agencies, launched effective counteroffensives that systematically cut off supply lines and isolated the insurgent positions. By late 1965, it became glaringly obvious to Che that the Congolese intervention was a strategic failure. The local movement lacked the necessary political consciousness, unified leadership, and popular base required to sustain a successful guerrilla campaign against an entrenched adversary. The realization weighed heavily on his shoulders, confronting him with the stark limitations of trying to export the Cuban model to a vastly different cultural, historical, and social context without deep roots among the local population. Reluctantly, and with a heavy heart, Che accepted the inevitable reality of defeat in the Congo. He spent several clandestine months hiding out in East Africa and Europe, reflecting deeply on the lessons of the African campaign, and writing extensive journals analyzing the myriad causes of the failure. These writings revealed a man of rigorous intellectual honesty who refused to sugarcoat mistakes, meticulously dissecting the subjective weaknesses of leadership and the objective difficulties of transplanting revolution into alien soil. Yet, far from dampening his revolutionary ardor, the failure in Africa only deepened his resolve to continue the fight. Rather than returning permanently to the safety of Cuba, where a comfortable life as an elder statesman awaited him, Che quietly turned his thoughts back toward his home continent of Latin America. He began plotting his next clandestine mission, determined to apply the lessons he had learned from his failures and successes alike in a new, highly secret guerrilla campaign in the heart of South America. Following the agonizing closure of the African chapter in his life, Ernesto Che Guevara turned his unwavering gaze back toward his home continent of South America. His mind was set on a new clandestine mission, one that would test his revolutionary theories on the very terrain where he had first awakened to the realities of inequality and poverty. The target chosen for this next great endeavor was Bolivia, a landlocked nation situated at the strategic geopolitical heart of the continent, bordered by 5 major countries. Che reasoned that a successful socialist revolution in Bolivia could serve as a vital political and military spark, sending shockwaves across the borders into Argentina, Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay, ultimately igniting a continental conflagration against imperialist dominance. Disguised with false passports, shaved hair, and altered physical appearances, Che traveled secretly through various European and Latin American capitals before finally slipping covertly into Bolivia in late 1966. He adopted the alias Adon and entered the rugged, sparsely populated southeastern region of the country, a remote landscape defined by dense thickets, dry riverbeds, rocky ridges, and thick foliage known as the Nyankahuazu. This wild terrain was chosen precisely for its isolation, offering a secluded base camp from which a guerrilla nucleus could train, organize, and eventually expand its operations into the broader countryside. Around him gathered a tightly knit cadre of loyal fighters, composed primarily of seasoned Cuban veterans who had volunteered to follow their commander once more, alongside a small and dedicated corps of Bolivian recruits who shared their radical vision. Together, this small band established their primary encampment along the banks of the Nyankahuazu River, carving out rudimentary shelters, setting up supply caches, and beginning the grueling physical conditioning required to survive in the unforgiving wilderness. Yet, from the very inception of the Bolivian campaign, the endeavor was afflicted by profound strategic miscalculations and compounding misfortunes that threatened to unravel the project before it had even truly begun. Unlike the towering peaks of the Sierra Maestra in Cuba, where the rebel army enjoyed deep, organic ties with the local peasantry and rural laborers who provided vital intelligence, food, and recruits, the remote southeastern region of Bolivia proved remarkably inhospitable to foreign revolutionaries. The local campesinos in the Ñancahuazú Valley were deeply suspicious of outsiders, spoke local indigenous dialects that the Cuban volunteers struggled to understand, and had little to no historical awareness of Marxist theory or continental anti-imperialist struggle. Many peasants were poor tenant farmers tied to local landlords or focused entirely on bare subsistence agriculture, viewing armed strangers with immense caution and fear of government retribution. Furthermore, the Bolivian Communist Party, led by Mario Monge, maintained an ambivalent and deeply strained relationship with Che. While party leaders initially agreed to offer nominal support, intense political rivalries, ideological disagreements over who should hold supreme command of the armed struggle, and fears of total annihilation led the party leadership to ultimately withhold crucial urban networks, financial resources, and reliable recruits. Consequently, Che and his men found themselves isolated in the wilderness, operating in a political vacuum without the vital urban backing or peasant mass base that their guerrilla manual dictated as absolute prerequisites for victory. Despite these mounting structural barriers, Che maintained a rigorous daily routine within the camp, enforcing strict military discipline, conducting political education classes, maintaining his detailed campaign diaries, and personally tending to the ailments of his men despite his own chronic, debilitating asthma attacks. The environment itself was a relentless antagonist. The tropical climate of the Ñancahuazú brought torrential seasonal rains that swelled the rivers into raging torrents, washing away trails, destroying food supplies, and making movement through the dense underbrush an exhausting, agonizing trial. Mosquitoes, ticks, and various tropical parasites tormented the fighters day and night, while infections and foot rot spread rapidly through the ranks due to a lack of proper boots and medical supplies. Rations quickly dwindled as hunting proved difficult and supply lines failed to materialize, forcing the guerrilla band to subsist on meager portions of parched corn and wild game. By early 1967, the fragile secrecy of the camp was shattered when local authorities stumbled upon evidence of armed strangers in the region, prompting the Bolivian government to mobilize its armed forces. Alarmed by reports of a guerrilla insurgency, the military launched reconnaissance patrols into the rugged interior, leading to early skirmishes that forced Che to split his forces into smaller, mobile columns to evade encirclement. This tactical division proved disastrous, as the two columns became separated for months due to broken communication lines and swollen rivers, severely weakening the overall combat strength of the insurgent force. As the months wore on, the net steadily tightened around Che and his remaining comrades. The Bolivian government, receiving crucial military assistance, counterinsurgency training, and logistical intelligence from Washington, deployed elite, American-trained Ranger battalions specifically equipped to hunt down guerrillas in difficult terrain. Every movement the guerrillas made was tracked or anticipated. Local informants tipped off military commanders about supply drops and safe houses, and the surrounding population consistently refused to join their ranks or offer shelter. Cut off from external communication, physically exhausted by malnutrition and disease, and hunted relentlessly by superior military forces. The little band was slowly driven deeper into barren, rocky ravines where escape routes were systematically blocked. Che's detailed journal entries from this period reflect a poignant awareness of the tightening trap, yet they also reveal his characteristic stubborn resolve to press forward against impossible odds, refusing to abandon the mission even as the fundamental conditions for success dissolved around him. The Bolivian campaign was rapidly transforming from a bold revolutionary offensive into a desperate battle for sheer survival, marking the final, tragic theater in the life of the legendary guerrilla commander. The relentless passage of the dry winter months in the rugged valleys and scrub-covered ridges of southeastern Bolivia brought no relief to the hunted and exhausted guerrilla band led by Ernesto Che Guevara. By the early days of October 1967, the campaign that had begun with such high ideological aspirations had been reduced to a desperate struggle for bare existence against overwhelming military odds. The small circle of fighters had dwindled significantly through casualties, disease, desertions, and relentless combat engagements with the elite counterinsurgency units of the Bolivian armed forces. Those who remained were worn down to the bone, their bodies ravaged by chronic malnutrition, severe vitamin deficiencies, persistent foot rot, and the damp, freezing nights that swept across the high-altitude terrain. For Che himself, the physical toll was exceptionally grueling. His lifelong affliction with severe asthma, which had dogged him from his childhood in Argentina through the humid heights of the Sierra Maestra and the jungles of Africa, flared up with terrifying frequency in the thin, sharp air of the Bolivian mountains. Lacking proper inhalers and essential medication, he often struggled for every breath while managing the day-to-day coordination of his dwindling column. Yet, despite the agonizing physical deterioration and the hopeless strategic outlook, Che maintained his customary rigorous routine, recording meticulous entries in his campaign diary, and attempting to instill discipline among his remaining men as they navigated the treacherous ravines and dry riverbeds of the region. The net closing around the guerrillas was the product of a coordinated military apparatus. The Bolivian army, bolstered by specialized training, advanced logistical support, and real-time intelligence supplied by United States military advisors, had systematically mapped the region and deployed heavily armed ranger battalions to seal off every possible escape route. Local campesinos, alienated by cultural barriers, language differences, and fear of violent government reprisals, consistently withheld food, shelter, and intelligence from the foreign insurgents, leaving the guerrillas completely isolated in a hostile human landscape. Intelligence operatives and rural informants tracked the movements of the ragged column with increasing precision, relaying their exact coordinates to high-ranking military commanders who directed sweeping encirclement operations through the thick brush and steep rock formations. By the first week of October, Che's column was trapped within the narrow, confining gorge of the Euro Ravine, a jagged, steep-sided canyon located near the small remote settlement of La Higuera. The gorge offered minimal cover and severely limited maneuverability, acting as a natural bottleneck that effectively cut off any possibility of tactical retreat. On the morning of October 8, 1967, a large detachment of elite Bolivian ranger troops, having received precise tips from local informants regarding suspicious movements in the area, moved swiftly to seal both ends of the Euro Ravine. As the troops descended into the rocky basin, they caught the small group of surviving guerrillas completely by surprise, unleashing a sudden and intense volume of concentrated rifle and machine gun fire that echoed sharply off the canyon walls. Trapped in a crossfire with virtually no ammunition left and severely outnumbered, the guerrillas fought back with desperate valor, but their position was entirely untenable. During the fierce skirmish, Che Guevara attempted to direct defensive positions and protect his wounded comrades, but his rifle was struck and rendered useless by enemy fire, and a bullet shattered the barrel of his carbine while another grazed his leg. Hampered by his acute asthma and unable to break through the tight military cordon closing in around him, Che was wounded in the lower leg and captured alongside one of his remaining companions, a guerrilla known by the nom de Guerra Willie. The brief, intense clash in the Euro ravine marked the absolute final military engagement of the ill-fated Bolivian campaign, effectively extinguishing the armed guerrilla movement that Che had sought to plant at the geopolitical heart of the South American continent. Following his capture, the wounded prisoner was disarmed and marched under heavy military guard out of the rocky gorge up toward the nearby highland village of La Higuera. The village was a modest, isolated collection of adobe houses with whitewashed walls and clay tile roofs, perched precariously upon the windswept Andean slopes. Upon arrival, the captive commander was placed inside the small, austere adobe schoolhouse that served as the community's primary municipal and educational building. The rustic structure featured a dirt floor, rough wooden benches, and bare plaster walls, offering a stark and solemn shelter as a steady stream of military officers, intelligence personnel, and curious onlookers arrived to catch a glimpse of the legendary revolutionary whose name had become synonymous with armed anti-imperialist struggle across the globe. Throughout the afternoon and evening of October 8, and into the following morning of October 9, high-ranking officers of the Bolivian armed forces, along with visiting foreign intelligence agents, interrogated the captive. Despite his physical exhaustion, bandaged wounds, torn clothing, and unkempt appearance, Che maintained a composed, stoic, and dignified silence, or responded to questioning with sharp, measured defiance, refusing to offer any strategic information that could endanger his surviving comrades or compromise his political convictions. He sat quietly on a low wooden stool within the dimly lit schoolhouse, his weathered face reflecting the profound weight of a lifetime dedicated to radical political transformation, while the military leadership outside debated his immediate fate amidst urgent communications with the highest levels of the national government in La Paz. The orders that eventually arrived dictated a definitive conclusion to the captive's journey. On the morning of October 9, 1967, instructions were transmitted to the military personnel stationed in La Higuera to carry out the execution of the prisoner. The sentence was executed inside the same modest adobe schoolhouse where he had spent his final hours of captivity. The death of Ernesto Che Guevara marked the abrupt closure of an extraordinary life dedicated to armed insurrection, socialist theory, and continental revolution, bringing an end to the physical existence of a man who had become one of the most polarizing and influential figures of the 20th century. Within hours of the execution, military authorities secured the body, placing it strapped to the landing skids of a military helicopter for transport to the nearby town of Vallegrande. There, in the laundry room of the local hospital, the body was laid out for public viewing and photographic documentation by international journalists, local officials, and military commanders, intended by the state as definitive visual proof to the world that the guerrilla insurgency had been successfully crushed. Yet, rather than dampening the fires of revolutionary sentiment, the dramatic circumstances of his capture, his defiant final hours, and his unceremonious death served to project his image far beyond the borders of Bolivia. The stark finality of those October days in the rugged Andean highlands stripped away the day-to-day political controversies of his administrative tenure in Cuba and his military setbacks in Africa, casting his final moments in a heroic, tragic light that resonated deeply with student movements, labor unions, anti-war activists, and leftist intellectuals across every continent. The quiet, remote village of La Higuera, the rocky walls of the Uro ravine, and the simple adobe schoolhouse were instantly transformed into historic landmarks of global political mythology, marking the physical end of a restless rebel's journey, and simultaneously laying the foundational bedrock for the enduring, mythic iconography that would define his legacy for generations to come. The gunfire in the little adobe schoolhouse of La Higuera had barely faded into the thin Andean air when the name Ernesto Che Guevara began its transformation from a mortal man into an immortal myth. For years, the governments that opposed him, along with the intelligence agencies that tracked his every movement through the rugged jungles of Africa and the high ravines of Bolivia, believed that his death would spell the definitive end of his revolutionary project. They imagined that by eliminating the physical body of the rebel leader, they were extinguishing a dangerous ideological spark that had threatened the stability of the Western Hemisphere. But history rarely follows the neat, predictable paths laid out by military strategists. Instead of silencing his voice, the tragic and defiant circumstances of his final days amplified it to a global scale, turning a defeated guerrilla commander into the most recognizable icon of rebellion the modern world had ever seen. In the immediate aftermath of October 1967, international news agencies flooded the world with photographs taken in the laundry room of the hospital in Vallegrande, where the body of the fallen guerrilla had been laid out for public viewing. Those stark, haunting images flashed across television screens and appeared on the front pages of newspapers from London and Paris to Tokyo and New York. Paradoxically, rather than projecting defeat or deterring potential followers, the composure and features of the dead man evoked an eerie resemblance to classical Renaissance depictions of fallen martyrs. To millions of young people, students and workers living through a decade defined by cultural upheaval, civil rights struggles, and widespread opposition to the Vietnam War, that face became a mirror reflecting their own deepest desires for radical social change and defiance against entrenched authority. The image stripped away the bureaucratic complications of government administration and the harsh realities of guerrilla combat, leaving behind a pure distillation of romantic resistance. Within months, this visual representation underwent a rapid commercial and cultural evolution, driven largely by the work of Italian publisher Giacomo Feltrinelli. Seeking to harness the revolutionary energy sweeping Europe, Feltrinelli distributed posters featuring the iconic photograph taken by Alberto Korda during a memorial service in Havana years earlier. This image, capturing Che in his black beret gazing into the distance with an expression of unwavering resolve, quickly detached itself from its specific political origins and began to circulate as a universal symbol of nonconformity. It appeared on protest placards during the massive student riots in Paris in May 1968, fluttered above demonstrations in West Berlin, and was carried through the streets of Mexico City and Washington, D.C. The rebel who had spent his life crossing borders to ignite armed insurrections across Latin America and Africa suddenly found his likeness crossing every cultural, linguistic, and ideological barrier imaginable. The global fascination with Che Guevara was not sustained by imagery alone. It was deeply fueled by the circulation of his written words. His detailed accounts of the Cuban revolutionary struggle, particularly his book Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, and his meticulous Bolivian diary, were translated into dozens of languages, finding eager readers among intellectuals, university students, and political activists. These texts offered more than just military history or tactical manuals for guerrilla warfare. They presented a deeply moral philosophy centered on the creation of the Hombre Nouveau, or the new man, a socialist citizen motivated entirely by altruism, solidarity, and a total rejection of material greed. For a generation disillusioned by the cold materialism of both Western capitalism and Soviet bureaucracy, Che's uncompromising idealism offered a pure, alternative vision of human society, even if the practical implementation of his theories had often proven exceptionally difficult and divisive in the real world. As the decades progressed, this transformation reached every corner of global popular culture, creating a fascinating paradox that would have likely horrified the austere revolutionary himself. The face that had once looked down from guerrilla encampments in the Sierra Maestra and the Bolivian highlands was soon printed on T-shirts, album covers, coffee mugs, and fashion accessories, worn just as frequently by pop stars and teenagers seeking a fashionable edge of rebellion as by dedicated leftist militants fighting for social justice. This widespread commercialization sparked intense debate among historians, political analysts, and cultural critics. Some argued that turning a revolutionary leader into a mass-market commodity completely defanged his political message, transforming a serious Marxist theoretician and military commander into a harmless, depoliticized fashion statement. Others suggested that the enduring presence of his image served as a persistent reminder of global inequality, keeping alive the critical questioning of imperialism and capitalist exploitation long after the specific geopolitical conflicts of the Cold War had faded into history. Yet, beneath the swirling currents of commercial pop culture and political mythology, the core of Che Guevara's legacy remained firmly rooted in the complex historical realities of his life. Across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, grassroots movements, labor unions, and peasant organizations continued to invoke his name not merely as a fashion icon, but as a genuine symbol of sacrifice, international solidarity, and the relentless pursuit of social equity. Statues, murals, and monuments were erected in his honor in public squares from Havana to Buenos Aires, while schools, clinics, and community centers adopted his name to inspire new generations with his dedication to public service and revolutionary education. Even governments that viewed his political ideology with deep suspicion could not ignore the profound cultural footprint he had left upon the collective consciousness of the developing world. The evolution from a restless medical student wandering the dusty roads of South America on a motorcycle into an international icon of resistance stands as one of the most remarkable transformations of the 20th century. Che Guevara had set out to change the world through direct, armed intervention, believing that the fires of revolution could sweep away centuries of oppression and give birth to a just society. While his own life ended tragically in the isolated ravines of Bolivia, cut short by the very military forces he sought to overthrow, his death paradoxically achieved what his campaigns could not. It lifted him out of the messy, contested arena of day-to-day politics and placed him firmly inside the pantheon of global myth. Whether viewed as a heroic champion of the oppressed, a romantic visionary, or a rigid dogmatist whose methods brought immense suffering, The rebel from Rosario ultimately transcended his historical moment to become a permanent fixture of the human imagination, a haunting and enduring reminder of the eternal struggle between established power and the desire for radical change. When you look past the stylized posters, the t-shirts, and the political slogans, you find a human being whose life was defined by extreme contrasts. Ernesto Che Guevara was a medical doctor who chose the gun over the stethoscope. He was an upper-middle-class intellectual from Argentina who lived among impoverished peasants in the Cuban mountains. He was a passionate writer who kept detailed journals of his deepest thoughts, yet he was also an uncompromising military commander who ordered executions without hesitation. To understand the man behind the legend, one must look closely at both his extraordinary idealism and the harsh, controversial reality of his actions. On one side of the scale stands the romantic visionary. Che was genuinely motivated by a deep anger against poverty, social inequality, and foreign exploitation. His early travels across Latin America were not just recreational trips. They were life-changing experiences that opened his eyes to the suffering of ordinary workers, miners, and indigenous communities. He could have easily chosen a comfortable life as a physician in Argentina. Instead, he gave up personal wealth, family life, and material security to fight for what he believed was a better world. His commitment was absolute. He never asked his soldiers to do anything he would not do himself. Whether carrying heavy loads through swampy jungles despite his severe asthma, working unpaid weekend shifts in Cuban factories, or leading troops into dangerous combat, he led strictly by personal example. This uncompromising devotion to his principles made him a powerful symbol of selflessness. He rejected the luxuries of government power, eventually giving up his high offices in Cuba to fight in the jungles of the Congo and Bolivia. For millions of people across the global South, Che represented an unyielding stand against imperialism and corporate greed. His concept of the new human, a citizen driven by solidarity and love for humanity rather than money and material desire, remains one of the most ambitious and idealistic visions of social change proposed in the 20th century. However, on the other side of the scale lies a far darker and more controversial historical reality. Che Guevara was not just a romantic dreamer. He was a hardline Marxist-Leninist who believed that the end justified the means. During and after the Cuban Revolution, he showed a ruthless approach to political opponents, suspected traitors, and class enemies. As the supreme commander of the La Cabaña fortress prison in 1959, he oversaw the summary trials and executions of hundreds of individuals associated with the former Batista regime. Critics point out that these trials lacked basic due process and fair legal defense, reflecting Che's firm belief that revolutionary justice did not need to follow traditional bourgeois legal standards. His economic policies in Cuba also drew severe criticism. As the head of the National Bank and later the Minister of Industries, Che attempted to rapidly transform Cuba's economy by centralizing control, eliminating market incentives, and relying almost entirely on moral motivation. While his intentions were rooted in his idealist vision, the practical results were often disastrous. Industrial production plummeted, administrative inefficiency grew, and economic shortages became widespread. His rigid dogmatism and refusal to compromise with economic realities created immense hardship for the very working-class people he sought to uplift. Furthermore, Che's military strategy of the FOCO, the belief that a small group of dedicated guerrilla fighters could create the conditions for a successful revolution anywhere, proved to be deeply flawed. While it had worked under the unique political and social conditions of Cuba, attempts to copy this model elsewhere failed completely. In the Congo and Bolivia, Che ignored local political dynamics, failed to build genuine relationships with local peasant populations, and dismissed the advice of established local communist parties. His strategic inflexibility led directly to the destruction of his forces and his own tragic demise in the Bolivian mountains. Today, the debate surrounding Che Guevara remains as intense as ever. To his admirers, he is an eternal hero who gave his life fighting against tyranny and injustice. To his detractors, he was a cold, dogmatic fanatic whose actions promoted authoritarianism and brought destruction wherever he went. Yet, perhaps the true importance of Che Guevara lies precisely in this complexity. He was neither a pure saint nor an unmitigated villain, but a deeply complex historical figure shaped by the turbulent ideological conflicts of the Cold War era. Decades after his death, Che Guevara continues to provoke passionate discussions about power, violence, idealism, and social justice. His life story serves as a profound case study in the power and danger of political conviction. The rebel from Rosario lived and died by an unbending faith in radical change, leaving behind a legacy that continues to challenge, inspire, and divide the world. As long as human societies face inequality, oppression, and the search for a better future, the figure of Che Guevara will remain an enduring